In a time of profound social and cultural change, an entire generation of young Americans stood united in their desire for more powerful cars, fueling the greatest horsepower war in automotive history. Screeching rubber through turns, roaring down back streets and country lanes, were fun-loving drivers in their wild and powerful dream machines. Just about anyone could afford to fly down the road in a boldly styled, attention-grabbing American icon, the muscle car. Hello, I'm Chip Foose, coming to you from the Marconi Automotive Museum in Tustin, California. Purists could sit around all day and debate what is or isn't a muscle car. And while some cars certainly exist on the fringe of what we generally consider to be a muscle car, their stories are no less important to the history of this remarkable era of performance. Just as the Pontiac GTO ushered in the era of the muscle car, so too did Ford create an entirely new classification of car, one that existed alongside the traditional mid-size big block muscle cars, and more often than not, kicked butt. At the New York World's Fair in April 1964, Ford introduced the Mustang, generally considered the first of a new breed of car that would come to be known as pony cars. They handled better than heavier, longer wheelbase cars, though usually at the cost of smaller engines and less straight-line speed.
Unlike, say, most muscle cars, which have a three-box design, which is an equal-sized trunk and engine and passenger compartment, the pony cars have a long hood and a short deck, the trunk, with a passenger compartment.
While Ford sold well over 1 million Mustangs in the first 18 months, very few of those sales were going toward buyers with an eye on performance.
Some cars kind of evolved into muscle cars. They weren't born that way. For example, the Mustang didn't start out as a muscle car. It started out as every person's car. You could use it to go get groceries. You could dress it up. You can dress it down. It's something for everybody except for the muscle people.
In order to lend some racing credibility to its flagship model, Ford turned to a trusted business partner who knew more than a little bit about horsepower.
My name's Carroll Shelby, and performance is my business.
The 427 Cobra proved that Shelby had the performance acumen to create a high horsepower track car that could scream down the quarter mile.
Shelby did instill within the Mustang line a sense of performance, and as the years went by, the Mustang grew some hair in its chest.
It wasn't until the introduction of a big block boulevard cruiser that the Shelby Mustangs took their place in the high horsepower ranks of the true muscle cars. The 1967 GT500 was the first big block Mustang. It featured a 428 cubic inch Police Interceptor V8 with dual Holley 4-barrel carbs. In '68, the dual carbs were replaced with a single 4-barrel carb and an aluminum intake manifold. Allegedly, the engine made 5 more horsepower, though horsepower numbers of the era were notoriously fickle.
428, they say, put out 365 horsepower. That's been debated whether Ford was downgrading that for insurance purposes, but it has plenty of power. When you push the pedal down and the secondaries kick in, it pushes you into the seat, no matter really how fast you're going.
The 1968 GT500 was the first production Shelby Mustang offered as a convertible, and only 402 ragtops were built, making them sought after by collectors. It breathed in through a distinctive hood scoop with dual inlets in front and louvers along the rear. It breathed out from large diameter dual exhaust. With Cobra badging on the engine components and on the body itself, the '68 GT500 kept tradition with the Shelby Mustangs of the past while pushing pony cars in a bold new direction of heart-stopping performance.
The first time I realized this car exists was in November 1967 when I was reading a gentleman's magazines for the article, and there was an actual picture in that magazine. What was unique about this car is that it was around about a block away in a garage under a cover when I found out it was there. The gentleman who owned it said he was scared to drive it.
Mustang didn't really get its muscle car reputation until Ford started putting bigger and bigger and bigger engines in it. When you have far more engine than you could possibly use under regular circumstances, then you have a muscle car.
Coming up, the race-dominating pony car from Chevrolet.
The Z28 might not have quite that same slam you into the trunk feeling when you let out the clutch, but they could get down the road really well.
The runaway popularity of the Mustang prompted Ford's competition to get into the game. This battle for market share produced some very cool cars, but none with the cultural impact of the Chevrolet Camaro. At the press conference introducing the car, Chevrolet said that a Camaro was, quote, a small vicious animal that eats Mustangs. And Chevy was soon challenging Ford for pony car supremacy in dealerships and on racetracks across the country. Debuting in 1967, first-generation Camaros were built on a GM F-body platform and designed to fit a number of different engine configurations, all the way up to the monster 427 V8. But it was the small block V8 Z28 Camaros that garnered the most attention in 1969.
Most muscle cars were just big, strong, dumb bruisers that could go really fast, whereas the Z28 might not have quite that same slam you into the trunk feeling when you let out the clutch, but they could get down the road really well, and then they could turn and they could stop, and they look good doing it. Cast iron engines are heavy. When you've got well over 400 cubic inch engine, you've got a lot of iron in front of the front tires, and if you can reduce that even by a few hundred pounds, your performance is going to be enhanced. Well, if you've got 350, maybe 400 real world horsepower with 400 fewer pounds to drag around, the car's going to be pretty quick.
This garnet red example from the Muscle Car City collection has the Hurst shifter, close ratio 4-speed gearbox, functional cowl induction hood, and dealer-installed dual 4-barrel Hollies. And when GM Skunk Works decided the 302 needed a bit more zip, they developed the cross-ram induction setup seen here. But in order to be sanctioned for racing, the cross-ram needed to be available to the general public. So when ordered, the setup came in the trunk to be installed after purchase. It all added up to one hell of a powerful engine.
I'm not a betting man typically, but that 302 motor is rated at 290 horsepower from the factory that you could check the box and order that car. I'd venture to say the actual output of that vehicle is much greater than 290 horsepower. It's a performance car. The jury's out on whether you should call that a muscle car or not. Now, certainly the Z28s have my respect. They create a significant amount of horsepower. The goal of these cars was road racing. The regulation for those cars was 5 liters. And so the manufacturers started building cars specifically and offering them to the public to meet the homologation regulations.
The Z28 was built in part to compete in the recently formed Trans Am series, and it delivered. With a hard-charging Mark Donohue behind the wheel, Chevrolet took the Trans Am points title in 1968 and 1969. The Z28 made believers out of a lot of muscle car fans, and also helped bring Trans Am racing to the masses. The series proved so popular that Pontiac, wanting to get in on this pony car business, used the name for their high-performance Firebirds that shared the same F-body platform as the Camaro. The Trans Am remained popular and powerful well into the 70s, and the irony of the name was not lost on the muscle car world.
Of course, they come out with a Trans Am, but they couldn't even run a Trans Am because it had a 400 motor in it. I think 305 cubic inches, somewhere like that, was all you were allowed to have to race Trans Am.
The Firebird 400 was, I think, Pontiac's answer to the pony car wars. And the Trans Am, especially the 1969 Trans Am, was also the answer to Chevrolet's Camaro, and was a very popular car, especially the 400 cubic inch. So it was a very competitive car. and a good street race car. A number of Pontiacs that I remember growing up were street raced. 69 Trans Ams were street raced. It wasn't just road racing.
This 69 Trans Am is powered by the 400 cubic inch, 335 horsepower Ram Air V8. It also featured forward-facing dual hood scoops, which could be opened by the driver, delivering cold air to a 4-barrel quadrajet carb. Rounding out the car's profile were side scoops, a rear spoiler, and 14-inch wheels.
Firebird was probably a little bit fancier car. Pontiac always does just seem like a step up in quality of interiors and body trim and stuff like that. And the price was $400 or $500 difference, which doesn't sound like much today, but it was a lot. You know, back then, it could make a large difference in your monthly payment.
Still ahead, the most powerful engine is shoehorned into a pony car.
And you put a big block engine in a pony car, and they became muscle cars. They didn't really want to stop, but boy, they could go like a muscle car, real fast in a straight line.
In addition to its nimble race-winning small block Camaros, Chevrolet was also rolling out torque-laden Camaros that were the equal of any A-body muscle car on the market. While Chevy offered large displacement engines in their pony car from the very beginning, the second year of production would see the Camaro's popularity increase with improved handling, refined styling, and big block street cred. Big block Camaros really hit their stride in 1968 as the Camaro SS 396 was helping dispel the myth that pony cars could only sport small engines.
The pony cars weren't just available in small blocks. They were available with big block engines. And you put a big block engine in a pony car, and it was a tight fit in under the hood. They were all of a sudden, they became muscle cars. You put that much weight up front, they really weren't agile. They didn't really want to stop, but boy, they could go like a muscle car, real fast in a straight line.
This rare tuxedo black 1968 396 cubic inch 4-speed Camaro has the special order 375 horsepower L78 engine option. The RSSS package includes hidden headlights and performance suspension. The deluxe interior features console instruments and wood grain steering wheel. The popularity of both the big block and small block Camaros presented a challenge for Chevy dealers.
The manufacturers in the showroom are starting to compete with themselves. So you couldn't advertise the 302 against a much more streetable super sport car or even a big block car.
At that point, it pretty much morphs itself into a muscle car because it's going to deliver much the same performance experience as a traditional muscle car, and that is superb, brutal, straight line acceleration, marginal stopping and handling.
And as pony car engine displacement grew during the late 60s, the horsepower arms race took center stage.
Most of the large block pony cars, you might say, they all delivered pretty much equal performance. They could cover the length of the quarter mile in the 13-second range for the most part.
If the 375 horsepower Camaro couldn't quite get it done for you, Chevrolet customers looking for more power at the drag strip had their dealer order special packages with the largest V8 available at the time.
That's central office production order. In the 60s, mid to late 60s, through that program, you could order absolutely anything you wanted on a Chevrolet. Just you had to get it approved through central office production. And so when you say Copo, everybody just thinks of 427 in the smaller body car, and that's primarily what it was used for.
They backdoored Chevrolet. They basically ordered these 427 Camaros. That was one of the ways to work around the restrictions of what Chevrolet was not allowing 427s to go in Camaros. Now, the image of the Corvette was that the top of the food chain in performance for Chevrolet, and why would you want a Camaro that's faster than your top dog?
This Hugger Orange 1969 Copo was ordered with steel wheels and a close ratio 4-speed gearbox. Under the air-breathing hood with built-in sealed plenum chamber is the massive 427 cubic inch V8, rated at 425 horsepower. Up next, Ford builds a Hemi.
Race engines don't take well to driving in stop-and-go traffic. You know, you really had to modify the vehicle if you wanted to get serious street results or a drag strip result.
In the first first 3 years of the car's existence, Chevy sold around 700,000 Camaros. Add that to the explosive popularity of the Mustang, and it was clear to everyone in Detroit that pony cars meant big sales. While Ford lagged behind Chevy in bringing performance to these cars, it was an era they were not slow to correct, as competitors to both the nimble Z28 and the burly Camaro SS soon began to arrive in dealerships across the country. In 1968, Ford began fitting out Mustangs and Shelby Mustangs with its impressive Cobra Jet and Super Cobra Jet engines. Conservatively rated at 335 horsepower, they usually ran ahead of their competitors a quarter mile at a time.
This was pretty much built as a race car for all intents and purposes. It really wasn't meant for the average person to drive it, but that's why it's also so much fun to drive. But I thought it was really unique to actually have a car that had this hidden speed about it that people necessarily wouldn't see, but at the same time, it's really the hood that really makes the difference. That Ram hood, that's how you really can tell this is a 428. What makes it really rare, there obviously were an awful lot of Mustang convertibles, but there only were, I think, 34 actual Cobra Jet 428 engine convertibles made in '68. So it really set the tone, I think. And it went really fast.
That was really a game changer for Ford. It was the first time that they had an engine that was comparable to other Detroit muscle car manufacturers in terms of street performance. It had great low-end torque. It had a good top end. You could run that car from light to light against anything coming out of any of the other car companies.
Ford, unlike General Motors and the group at Mopar, even by their own admission, Ford was sort of asleep at the wheel with the whole muscle car movement. They were concentrating heavily on the Mustang. And yet they realized that having a presence, especially on a racetrack, it really did have an effect on showroom traffic the following day, and Ford didn't want to completely lose track of that.
While Ford had bankrolled the Shelby Mustangs of the mid-60s, it wouldn't be until 1969 that the company built a production car that could compete in Trans Am racing against the Z28. The Boss 302 is considered one of the most impressive Mustangs in the model's history, and not without merit. The Boss name was derived from Ford stylist Larry Shinoda's nickname for his new boss, Bunky Knudsen. Using a canted valve cylinder intended for Ford's 351 cubic inch engine, creating what Ford engineers called a polyangle wedge combustion chamber. The solid lifter small block used the biggest carb employed by Ford, a 780 CFM Holley 4-barrel. It made a ludicrous amount of horsepower, roughly equal to that of a Z28.
The Boss 302, and that was built to compete in the Trans Am series, and that was a wonderful engine. The Boss 302 is just a high-spinning engine, durable. They rated that ostensibly at 290 horsepower. Yeah, it did 290. It did about 370, actually. But the Boss 302 was a great engine.
The car itself was no slouch. Underneath this 1970 Boss 302 4-speed is a performance suspension and power-assisted disc brakes. Form and function features include a front chin spoiler, rear window slats, an optional rear wing, blackout trim, and reflective C-stripes along the body. The 1970 Boss 302 also featured the highly coveted shaker hood option, which gave the Boss a distinctive profile. The Boss 302's big brother, the Boss 429, was also a purpose-built racer, offered to the public to fulfill homologation requirements. The car's namesake was its 429 cubic inch engine, originally built by Ford for its NASCAR program, and it had horsepower to spare, thanks to an engine configuration that's become known as the Semi-Hemi.
With the Boss 429 engine, the Blue Crescent motor, what you had were push rods operating valves that were re-angled to give a shape approximating that. What you ended up with was a much more powerful engine at far less cost than an overhead cam engine would have been.
Due to legal and insurance issues, Ford rated the production Boss 429 at 375 horsepower, but the actual number was likely well over 500. This 1970 model has the Hurst 4-speed gearbox and features a clean look with functional hood scoop and Boss 429 decals. Like many high-performance muscle cars of the era, the powerful Boss 429 engine was better suited to track use than in a driver-friendly street car.
The Ford 29s were kind of fragile. It was a race engine that they had to stick in a car to homologate it. And race engines don't take well to driving in stop-and-go traffic. You know, you really had to modify the vehicle if you wanted to get serious street results or a drag strip result.
The intense rivalry between Ford and GM pony cars not only fed into the performance craze of the 1960s, but it broadened the definition of what a muscle car could be. By offering full-blown horsepower packages in smaller cars, Ford and GM brought even more people into the muscle car world. And of course, Chrysler was not sitting idly by. The real winner was not a car company, but the consumer. From the Marconi Automotive Museum in Tustin, California, I'm Chip Foose. We'll see you next time on In a time of profound social and cultural change, an entire generation of young Americans stood united in their desire for more powerful cars, fueling the greatest horsepower war in automotive history. Screeching rubber through turns, roaring down back streets and country lanes, were fun-loving drivers in their wild and powerful dream machines. Just about